My name is Paul Cook. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as the reliable one. Not the loud one, not the impressive one, just reliable. I work in a professional environment where everything is tracked. Deadlines, shared drives, version histories, and meeting notes. It's the kind of place where people say they value teamwork, but recognition tends to follow visibility more than contribution. And visibility usually belongs to those who speak first, speak longest, or speak with confidence they haven't always earned. If you were to meet me casually, you probably wouldn't remember much. I'm calm. I listen more than I talk. I don't dominate rooms. I dress simply, show up early, and leave quietly. Colleagues often describe me as easy to work with, low maintenance, or solid. I used to take those words as compliments. I thought they meant trust. What I didn't realize, at least not at first, was that being underestimated doesn't always look like disrespect. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like people are assuming you'll fix things. Sometimes it looks like your work is being moved, edited, or questioned without anyone bothering to tell you. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing villains or humiliating anyone. There are no shouting matches here, no dramatic walkouts, no sudden victories. What I'm going to share is quieter than that, and more honest. It's a story about what happens when your contribution is erased without explanation, about what it feels like when a senior colleague deletes your work from a shared drive and no one asks why, about what it does to you when a report is late and only your name is questioned, even though the work passed through many hands. At first, this is a story about doubt, about self-correction, about wondering if maybe you really are as invisible as people treat you. Then, slowly, it becomes a story about awareness, about seeing patterns you once excused, about understanding the role you were quietly assigned and the cost of continuing to play it. There's no dramatic turning point you can point to on a calendar, no single moment where everything breaks. The change happens internally, piece by piece, through observation rather than confrontation, through restraint rather than reaction. I'm telling this story because I know I'm not the only one who's lived it, because quiet people are often told that silence is strength, but no one explains when silence stops protecting you and starts costing you something essential. What you'll hear is exactly how it happened, step by step. Not to stir anger, not to seek validation, but to be precise, honest, and clear about what quiet dominance actually looks like when it's earned, not performed. Before we begin, let me ask you one simple question. Have you ever felt trusted to carry the weight, but overlooked when it came time to ask who carried it? At work, I was known before I was seen. People knew my name because it appeared in comment histories, version logs, and meeting minutes. They knew I was dependable. They knew that if something was unclear, unfinished, or quietly falling apart, it could be routed in my direction and would come back resolved. What they didn't know, what they never seemed curious about, was how I worked, or what it cost me to keep things steady. I didn't have a reputation for ambition. I never announced what I was working on. I didn't defend my ideas aggressively in meetings. When someone interrupted me, I let it happen. When credit drifted toward louder voices, I assumed that was just how offices functioned. I told myself that quality work had its own gravity, that consistency would eventually speak for itself. To them, I was safe. Safe to assign extra tasks to. Safe to correct publicly. Safe to overlook. I was the person copied into email threads after decisions had already been made, not because my input was required, but because my execution was. If a senior colleague needed support preparing a report, I was included. If that same report later raised questions, I was suddenly very visible, usually in silence, with all eyes turning in my direction. No one ever accused me directly. That's important. This wasn't a hostile environment in the obvious sense. There were no raised voices or sharp words, just patterns. Small, repeating behaviors that, taken individually, could always be explained away. I became very good at explaining them away. When my work was edited without my knowledge, I told myself it was a collaboration. When sections I wrote appeared in presentations under someone else's name, I assumed it was an oversight. When my calendar filled up with quick asks that weren't quick at all, I thought that meant I was trusted. And trust felt like something to protect. There was a particular senior colleague, well-liked, confident, efficient in meetings, who seemed to rely on me heavily. He spoke with authority, summarized work clearly, and always looked composed. I respected him. More than that, I wanted to believe he respected me too. So when my contributions passed through his hands and came back altered, or sometimes missing, I didn't question it. I told myself that hierarchy worked this way, that visibility came with seniority, that my role was to support, not to stand out. What I didn't realize was that over time, support without acknowledgement turns into something else entirely. In meetings, I noticed how questions were framed. If a timeline slipped, the room didn't ask what happened. They asked who handled it. And more often than not, the answer landed on me. Not aggressively, casually, as if it were already understood. I started speaking less, not because I had nothing to say, but because I could predict the outcome. I would explain context, dependencies, changes that had occurred after my involvement, and the room would nod, then move on, already anchored to a conclusion. Still, I stayed. I stayed because I believed professionalism meant endurance. I stayed because I didn't want to be seen as difficult. I stayed because walking away felt like failure, and I wasn't ready to redefine what success meant. To them, I was reliable, predictable, replaceable. And for a long time, I accepted that role without realizing it was slowly rewriting how I saw myself. The first time it happened, it didn't feel important enough to react to. I had spent 3 evenings refining a section of a quarterly report. Data alignment, narrative flow, cross-referencing assumptions that didn't quite agree with each other. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was precise. The kind of work that prevents uncomfortable questions later. I saved the final version to the shared drive before leaving the office. I remember checking the timestamp twice, the way I always did. Old habit. Quiet paranoia, maybe. Either way, it gave me peace of mind. The next morning, I opened the file to prepare for a review meeting. My section was gone. Not edited. Not commented on. Gone. Entirely replaced by an earlier draft. One that still had unresolved figures and placeholder language. At first, I assumed it was a syncing issue. I refreshed, checked version history. That's when I saw it. A senior colleague had overwritten the file late the previous night. No note, no message, no explanation. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense yet. The rationalizations came quickly, almost automatically. Maybe he needed to test something. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe he planned to restore it later. By the time I realized that others were making assumptions for me about my boundaries, my tolerance, my role, it felt too late to redefine them without consequence. So I stayed still. Observant. Professional. That was the real decision, even though I didn't recognize it at the time. I chose silence because silence felt professional, because raising the issue felt awkward, as if I'd be accusing someone of something they probably didn't intend. During the meeting, the report was discussed using the older version. Questions came up, predictably, about inconsistencies I had already resolved. I explained them calmly, filling in gaps verbally, absorbing the confusion like it was part of my job. No one asked why the document had regressed. No one asked who had changed it. No one asked me whether I'd seen the latest version. After the meeting, a manager mentioned, almost casually, that the report felt a bit undercooked. The words weren't aimed sharply, but they landed anyway. I nodded, took responsibility, and said I'd tighten it up. Later that afternoon, the senior colleague stopped by my desk. He thanked me for jumping in during the meeting, said it was helpful. His tone was friendly, relaxed, as if nothing unusual had happened. I wanted to ask him why he'd deleted my work. The question formed clearly in my mind. It would have taken 10 seconds. Instead, I smiled and said, no problem. That night, I rewrote the section. Again, I told myself this was just how teamwork functioned under pressure. That people made decisions quickly. That intent mattered more than impact. I even felt a small sense of pride for handling it without conflict, for being adaptable. But something had shifted. Not anger, not yet, just awareness. I started checking version histories more often. I began keeping offline copies of my work, something I'd never felt the need to do before. Not because I distrusted anyone, at least that's what I told myself, but because I wanted control over what I could control. The cut was small, almost invisible. No one else noticed it, but I did. And once you notice something like that, you don't really unsee it. You just decide how much it matters. At the time, I decided it didn't. I decided to stay quiet. I decided to move on. That decision would echo longer than I expected. After that first incident, nothing dramatic happened, and that was exactly the problem. There was no escalation that would have justified a confrontation. No clear line crossed. Just a gradual accumulation of moments that all felt too small to challenge on their own, and too frequent to ignore altogether. Versions of my work would shift without comment. A sentence here, a chart there. Sometimes entire sections would be simplified, which usually meant stripped of nuance. When I asked clarifying questions, they were met with polite efficiency. We had to move fast. There wasn't time to loop everyone in. It's basically the same. Basically, I started to notice how often my name appeared only when something required explanation. When everything ran smoothly, The credit flowed upward or outward. When there was friction, my inbox filled quietly. The late report was the clearest example. A deliverable had passed through multiple layers, inputs from different teams, last-minute revisions requested by leadership, and dependencies outside my control. By the time it was finalized, the deadline had already slipped. In the review meeting, the question wasn't what caused the delay. It was, "Paul, can you explain why this came in late?" No one corrected the framing. No one added context. No one mentioned the revisions requested 2 days before submission. I answered calmly. I always did. I explained the process, the changes, and the approvals. Heads nodded, notes were taken, and then the conversation moved on, leaving behind the subtle impression that the delay belonged to me. Afterward, a colleague leaned over and said, "Tough one." Not accusatory, sympathetic, as if this was simply part of my role. And maybe it was. That's when I began to rationalize the pattern. I told myself that visibility invited scrutiny, and since I wasn't seeking visibility, scrutiny was the price of reliability. I told myself that staying composed mattered more than being right, that pushing back too often could label you as difficult, and once that label sticks, it doesn't wash off easily. So I adjusted. I became more careful with my language. I framed explanations defensively without sounding defensive. I documented decisions quietly for my own records. I stopped expecting acknowledgement and focused on accuracy instead. From the outside, nothing changed. If anything, I became even more efficient, more contained, less reactive. Inside, though, I was slowly learning a different lesson. That consistency without boundaries teaches people how to treat you. I watched how others operated, how some colleagues corrected narratives in real time, casually but firmly, how they reinserted themselves into conversations where credit might drift. They weren't louder, they were simply unwilling to let assumptions settle unchallenged. I wondered when I had decided that restraint was the same thing as integrity. There were moments when I almost spoke up, when a comment hovered just behind my teeth, perfectly reasonable, perfectly calm, and every time I measured the risk and chose silence. Not because I was afraid, but because I believed silence kept things stable. What I didn't see yet was that stability for the system didn't mean stability for me. By normalizing small dismissals, I was training everyone, including myself, to accept a version of my role that was increasingly narrow. I was the fixer, not the author. The responder, not the originator. The name you referenced when something needed explaining, not when it succeeded. And the most dangerous part was how reasonable it all seemed. No one was cruel. No one was overtly unfair. There was always a plausible explanation, which meant there was never a clean moment to object, only a growing weight of quiet concessions. I carried that weight without complaint, convinced that patience would eventually balance the scales. It didn't. It only taught the room what to expect from me, and what not to worry about. It took me longer than I care to admit to understand that roles don't always come with titles. Some are assigned silently, shaped by repetition and reinforced by what you don't resist. By the time you notice them, they feel less like a decision and more like a fact of nature. My role was clear once I finally named it. I was the reliable middle, the person between strategy and execution, between promise and delivery. I translated vague direction into concrete output, absorbed last-minute changes, and smoothed over inconsistencies before anyone else had to see them. I was useful, and usefulness, I learned, can be its own kind of trap. People didn't ask me if I could take something on. They asked when. Deadlines were discussed as if my availability were a constant. When a senior colleague needed support, my calendar was assumed to be flexible. When priorities shifted, my work shifted with them. No one framed this as exploitation. It was framed as trust, and I wanted to live up to it. In meetings, my presence served a specific function. I was there to clarify, to confirm, to reassure. If someone made a claim that leaned heavily on analysis I'd done, I was expected to nod. If questions arose, I was expected to answer. But the ownership of the work, the narrative around it, rarely sat with me. At first, I believed this was temporary, that proving myself would eventually lead to a different role. That once people saw how much I contributed, they'd naturally adjust their perception. But perception doesn't update itself. It has to be challenged. And I wasn't challenging it. There was a moment, small but telling, when a junior colleague thanked me for helping out on a project I had largely designed. Not maliciously, not dismissively. That's just how it had been presented to him. I smiled, said it was a team effort, and moved on. Later, alone, I realized something uncomfortable. If even the people closest to the work didn't know my role in it, that wasn't an accident. It was the result of how I had allowed the story to be told. I had mistaken humility for invisibility, and the system had rewarded me by making me indispensable but unseen. There's a strange comfort in that position. Expectations are low when it comes to recognition, but high when it comes to output. You're rarely challenged because no one feels threatened. You're rarely defended because no one thinks you need defending. I told myself this was sustainable, that I could continue operating this way indefinitely. But something about the late report lingered. About the deleted work. About the way questions always curved in my direction when something went wrong, and away from me when something went right. I began to see the pattern clearly. I wasn't just overlooked. I was positioned. Positioned to absorb risk. Positioned to stabilize outcomes. Positioned to make others look composed. And as long as I stayed quiet, the role remained intact. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. Because once you understand the role you've been given, you also understand the leverage hidden inside it. I didn't act on that yet. I didn't change my behavior. I didn't confront anyone or announce a boundary. I simply stopped pretending the role was accidental. And that awareness, quiet, internal, unshared, was the beginning of something different. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. There was no argument, no raised voice, no dramatic realization delivered like a line in a film. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, quietly, while I was alone. I was reviewing a project timeline, one of those documents that look straightforward until you trace how many hands have touched it. As I scrolled through emails, meeting notes, and file histories, I noticed something I'd somehow never lined up before. Every major decision point passed through me. Not formally, not visibly, but consistently. Assumptions were validated by me. Numbers were checked by me. Risks were flagged by me, often privately, often softened, so they wouldn't slow things down. When changes were requested, I was the one who recalculated the impact and adjusted delivery without escalating concerns. And yet, when leadership spoke about the project, my name never came up unless something needed explaining. For the first time, I didn't explain it away. I leaned back in my chair and just sat with that fact. What struck me wasn't frustration, it was clarity, a kind of stillness. I realized that the system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed, and I had been one of its most reliable components. That's when I asked myself a question I'd been avoiding for years. If I disappeared tomorrow, what would actually break? Not hypothetically, practically. I began listing things mentally. Processes that only worked because I quietly corrected them. Dependencies no one else tracked. Contexts that lived only in my notes and memory. I wasn't irreplaceable, but replacing me would be expensive, slow, uncomfortable. And that discomfort was something the system had been protected from, largely because of me. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel responsible. Responsible for how little pressure the system felt to treat me differently. I saw then how my silence had been interpreted, not as professionalism, but as consent. Not as a strength, but as availability. For years, I'd believed that staying calm, staying useful, staying unreactive would eventually earn respect. What it had actually earned was predictability. And predictability is easy to manage. That afternoon, I made a quiet decision. Not about anyone else, but about myself. I decided that silence would no longer be my default. Not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally. I stopped automatically absorbing responsibility for outcomes I didn't control. I stopped smoothing over issues before they were visible to the people who created them. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a change. I simply stopped editing reality to make it more comfortable for others. When a request came in with unclear ownership, I asked clarifying questions, in writing. When a deadline shifted because of late input, I documented it. When my work was altered, I saved versions. None of this was aggressive. None of it was emotional. It was precise. And the most surprising part was how quickly the atmosphere shifted. Not outwardly, but in the subtle way people responded. Questions became more careful. Requests became more specific. Some conversations moved elsewhere. That's when I understood something fundamental. Quiet dominance doesn't begin with control over others. It begins with control over what you're willing to carry in silence. That Tuesday didn't change my job. It changed my posture within it. And once posture changes, outcomes eventually follow. After that Tuesday, nothing looked different. I still arrived at the same time, sat at the same desk, attended the same meetings. From the outside, I was still Paul, the calm one, the steady one, the person who didn't make waves. But internally, silence had changed its meaning. Before, silence was automatic, a reflex, the fastest way to keep things moving. Now, silence was deliberate, chosen. And when you choose silence instead of defaulting to it, you start to notice how much noise it used to cover. The first test came sooner than I expected. A senior colleague sent over a quick update request late in the afternoon. It was framed casually, but the implication was familiar. I was expected to adjust the analysis to reflect a new direction, one that hadn't been discussed, approved, or documented. Before, I would have done it, quietly, efficiently. And if questions arose later, I would have explained the change as if it were my own decision. This time, I replied with a short message. I asked where the new assumption came from. I asked who had approved the change. I asked whether the timeline would be adjusted accordingly. No accusations, no tone, just questions. The response didn't come that day. When it did arrive the next morning, it was more cautious. The language had shifted. The certainty was gone. The request became a discussion. That's when I realized how much my previous silence had been doing for other people. It had protected them from accountability. It had absorbed ambiguity. It had allowed decisions to remain conveniently informal. By choosing when not to speak, and when to speak very precisely, I was changing the flow of responsibility without announcing it. Others mistook this shift for hesitation. I noticed it in meetings. When a question came up that clearly fell within my knowledge, I didn't jump in immediately. I waited. I let the room sit with the uncertainty for a moment. Sometimes someone else answered. Sometimes the question was reframed. Sometimes it was deferred. No one accused me of withholding information. They simply assumed I was less eager, less available. And that assumption worked in my favor, because eagerness had never earned me credit, only more work. I was still contributing, still delivering, still reliable, but I was no longer cushioning the system from its own pressure points. If something was unclear, it stayed unclear until the right person addressed it. If a decision lacked ownership, that absence became visible. At first, this made people uncomfortable. Then it made them careful. There was one moment that stood out, a meeting where a report delay was discussed. My name wasn't mentioned immediately. Instead, the conversation circled around dependencies, approvals, and late-stage changes. For the first time, the delay was described as a process issue, not a personal one. No one looked at me. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned. Silence, I learned, isn't weakness. Unchosen silence is. Chosen silence is a form of positioning. It tells people what you will and will not carry for them. The irony was that as I spoke less reactively, my words carried more weight. When I did clarify something, it was listened to, not because my voice was louder, but because it wasn't constant. Some colleagues began looping me in earlier, more thoughtfully. Others did the opposite and avoided involving me at all unless necessary. Both responses were revealing. What none of them realized was that I wasn't withdrawing. I was preparing. I was watching patterns shift, tracking who adapted and who didn't, not emotionally, analytically. And for the first time, I understood that staying quiet didn't mean staying small. It meant choosing the moment when silence ended and what replaced it. While things on the surface stayed calm, something else was happening underneath, and no one was watching closely enough to notice it. I didn't announce a strategy. I didn't make plans that looked like plans. What I did instead was return to habits I'd always had and refine them, quietly, patiently. I began documenting everything, not obsessively, not dramatically, but thoroughly. Decisions, assumptions, revisions, who requested what. When timelines shifted, where approvals came from, I kept it factual, unemotional, and consistent, the same way I approached my work. This wasn't new. What was new was why I was doing it. Before, documentation was a safety net for me. Now, it was a map. I noticed how often senior colleagues spoke with confidence about things they hadn't personally reviewed. I noticed how frequently my analysis was referenced indirectly, summarized by others, reframed, simplified. I noticed how version histories told a clearer story than meetings ever did. And I noticed how little redundancy there actually was. People assumed systems were robust because they had names attached to them. Committees, processes, layers of review. But in practice, many of those layers were thin, informal, dependent on trust and habit. Dependent on me. I didn't exploit that. I didn't alter outcomes. I simply stopped compensating silently when the system wobbled. When information was missing, I asked for it. When direction was vague, I requested clarity. When work came back altered, I saved copies and noted timestamps. All of this looked like diligence. No one questioned it. What they never noticed was how these small, reasonable actions changed the balance of information. I was no longer the person holding everything together invisibly. I was becoming the person who understood where everything actually rested. I also started paying attention to language. Who said we decided? Who said it was agreed? Who avoided specifics when responsibility might surface? In meetings, I let statements stand without correction, unless they directly misrepresented my work. And when they did, I corrected them calmly, with references, dates, files, versions. Not confrontational, just accurate. That accuracy did something subtle. It slowed people down. Suddenly, summaries became more careful. Assumptions were checked before being stated. Some colleagues stopped paraphrasing my work altogether and began deferring to me directly. Others didn't, and those were the ones I watched most closely. Preparation, I learned, doesn't feel like momentum. It feels like stillness, like observation, like letting patterns fully reveal themselves before you touch anything. There was no satisfaction in this phase, no sense of victory. If anything, it felt lonely. I was seeing the structure clearly now, and that clarity came with responsibility. I had to decide what kind of person I wanted to be with this knowledge. I wasn't interested in exposing anyone. I wasn't interested in embarrassing anyone. What I wanted was alignment between contribution and accountability, between effort and recognition, between silence and choice. So I kept preparing. I made sure my work was self-contained, traceable, defensible. I ensured that if questions ever arose, the answers wouldn't require interpretation, only reference. And all the while, the office kept moving. Meetings were held. Deadlines were discussed. Jokes were made. People assumed I was still doing what I'd always done. They didn't notice the shift because I didn't announce it. That's the thing about quiet preparation. It doesn't register as change until it's already finished. And by the time they sensed something was different, the groundwork had already been laid. The reveal didn't come as a shock. That surprised me. I had always assumed that if I ever truly saw the leverage, if I ever uncovered the thing that shifted the balance, it would arrive with a rush of emotion, anger, relief, vindication, something dramatic enough to justify all the quiet endurance that came before. Instead, it arrived like confirmation. I was reviewing documentation late one evening, cross-checking a chain of revisions tied to a long-running client engagement. Nothing urgent, just thoroughness. That's when I noticed how many critical decisions had no formal owner, only informal agreement, usually summarized by someone who hadn't done the underlying work. Those summaries pointed back to me, not by name, by implication. I traced the sequence carefully. Every major assumption originated in my analysis. Every risk mitigation plan was drafted by me. Every adjustment that kept the engagement within scope had passed through my hands before being approved elsewhere. And yet, the official narrative credited alignment, leadership, and teamwork without ever anchoring responsibility. That was the moment it became clear. If something went wrong, accountability would fall downward. If something went right, credit would diffuse upward. And I was the hinge. I realized that my position wasn't weak. It was structural. I was embedded at the point where interpretation became outcome, where raw input became decision-ready information, where errors could be corrected quietly or exposed unintentionally. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm, because leverage isn't about power over people. It's about understanding consequences. I saw that I had options, several of them. None of them required confrontation. None of them required exposure. All of them were irreversible once taken. I could continue as before, now with clearer eyes, and accept the role fully. I could push for formal recognition, forcing a renegotiation of visibility. Or I could do something subtler, stop translating ambiguity into certainty for others. That last option was the one that stayed with me, because ambiguity wasn't my creation. I had just been absorbing it. I looked back at the deleted work, the late report, the meetings where only my name was questioned. They weren't personal slights. They were symptoms of a system that assumed I would always be there to catch what fell through the cracks. The private reveal wasn't that I'd been wronged. It was that I had been useful in a very specific way, and that usefulness had value only if I chose to continue offering it under the same terms. I closed my laptop that night without making any decisions. Not because I was unsure, but because clarity doesn't demand urgency. Over the next few days, I tested the insight quietly. I let minor ambiguities stand. I declined to preemptively resolve issues that weren't mine to resolve. I watched how quickly uncertainty made its way upward when it wasn't softened on the way. It didn't take long. Meetings ran longer. Follow-up emails multiplied. People asked more questions, and not always to me. And that's when I knew the reveal was real. Nothing had broken. But the system was feeling friction it hadn't felt before. Not because I'd sabotaged anything, but because I'd stopped compensating silently. There was no celebration in that realization, just responsibility. Because once you see leverage clearly, you also see the line you don't want to cross. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want exposure. I didn't want anyone to fail. What I wanted was to step out of a role that had been defined by my willingness to disappear. And that required a decision. Not yet, but soon. A decision that couldn't be undone once made. Once you see the shape of a system clearly, pretending not to see it becomes a kind of dishonesty. That was the tension I lived with in the days that followed the reveal. I went to work. I answered messages. I delivered what was asked of me. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, every familiar interaction now carried an added layer of meaning. Because now I knew the cost of each option. If I stayed exactly as I was, I would remain protected in a narrow way. Predictable. Needed. Quietly relied upon. But I would also continue absorbing the consequences of decisions I didn't own and watching my work detach from my name the moment it became valuable. If I pushed for recognition, formal titles, clearer ownership, visible credit, I would force a conversation the system wasn't prepared for. It would create friction quickly. Some people would support it. Others would resist it. Either way, I would no longer be underestimated. And that came with risks I understood very well. The third option was harder to describe, even to myself. It wasn't about asking for anything. It wasn't about withdrawing effort. It was about changing what I allowed to pass through me. I thought carefully about the senior colleague who had deleted my work from the shared drive. About the meeting where the late report became my problem. About the subtle way responsibility always seemed to slide downhill. None of those moments required malice to exist. They only required an assumption. The assumption that I would fix it. The assumption that I wouldn't object. The assumption that I wouldn't let things fail loudly enough to be noticed. So the decision wasn't whether to act. It was whether to stop acting in a specific way. One afternoon, I opened my notebook, the worn black one I'd carried for years, and wrote a single sentence at the top of a fresh page. I will no longer translate ambiguity into safety for others. That sentence became my line. From that point on, I would still deliver excellent work. I would still be professional, precise, and calm. But I would not preemptively protect others from the consequences of unclear ownership, undocumented decisions, or last-minute changes. If something needed approval, it would wait for approval. If a change affected a deadline, that impact would be stated plainly. If my work were altered, the alteration would be traceable. This decision didn't feel bold. It felt inevitable. Because once you understand that your silence has been shaping outcomes, continuing that silence becomes a choice. And every choice carries responsibility. I didn't tell anyone what I'd decided. I didn't need to. This wasn't a stance meant to be seen. It was a boundary meant to be felt. There was a strange calm that came with it. Not relief, not excitement, just alignment. The kind you feel when your actions finally match your understanding. I knew some people would feel the change before they understood it. I knew there would be moments of confusion, maybe even frustration, but I also knew that nothing I was doing was unreasonable. That was the key. Quiet dominance isn't about forcing outcomes. It's about removing yourself from the machinery that hides them. Once I crossed that internal line, there was no going back, even if I wanted to, because I could no longer unknow what I knew. And the next phase, the one that followed, would test whether the system could adjust without the invisible support it had relied on for so long. From the outside, my behavior remained almost identical. I still responded promptly, still attended meetings, still delivered thorough work. No one could point to a single action and say, "This is where Paul changed." That was intentional, because the most effective shifts don't announce themselves. They simply alter what no longer happens. I stopped rescuing timelines that weren't mine to save. I stopped smoothing over contradictions before they were visible. I stopped filling in gaps that others had created and forgotten about. Not loudly, not dramatically, just by asking the kind of questions that should have been asked in the first place, and then waiting for answers before moving forward. One project in particular made this visible. A cross-functional report required inputs from 3 teams. Historically, I would chase those inputs quietly, integrate them, and adjust assumptions as needed to keep things on track. This time, I sent a single, clear message outlining what was needed, by when, and what would happen if it wasn't received. When the inputs arrived late and incomplete, I didn't compensate. I updated the timeline, documented the dependency, and shared the status as is. No blame, no commentary, just reality. The response was immediate, though not overt. Meetings were scheduled to align. Questions were asked about the process. The tone shifted from certainty to concern. Still, no one confronted me, and that told me everything. People sensed that something had changed, but they couldn't label it as resistance. Because resistance implies refusal. I wasn't refusing, I was complying, precisely. Another subtle change involved access. I had always been generous with context, offering background explanations unprompted. Now, I waited to be asked. When I was asked, I answered fully. When I wasn't, I let others operate without the benefit of my foresight. The result wasn't chaos, but inefficiency. And inefficiency has a way of traveling upward. The senior colleague, who had once overwritten my work, began looping me in more formally. Requests came with clearer framing. Approvals were documented. Deadlines were discussed instead of assumed. He never mentioned the change. Neither did I. That's the thing about moving in silence. It forces others to adapt without giving them a target. I was careful not to cross into passive aggression. I never delayed work unnecessarily. I never withheld information when it was explicitly requested. I simply stopped volunteering for protection. And slowly, responsibility redistributed itself. Not evenly, not perfectly, but visibly. The most interesting part was how this affected perception. People began referring to my work differently, not as support, but as analysis. Not as something that could be absorbed, but as something that needed to be understood before decisions were made. I didn't correct the language. I let it settle. There were moments when it would have been easier to revert, to step in, smooth things over, keep everything running quietly. Old habits tugged at me, especially when others seemed stressed. But I held the line, because I had learned that rescuing systems from their own pressure doesn't make them healthier. It just hides the cracks. Moving in silence wasn't about disappearing. It was about becoming unignorable without being loud. And by the time the consequences began to surface, there was no clear moment anyone could point to and say, "This is where it started," which meant it was already too late to undo. The first consequence wasn't dramatic. No alarms, no angry emails, no emergency meetings. It showed up as confusion. A project review ran long because no one could clearly explain why certain assumptions had been made. A senior manager asked where a particular figure came from, and instead of a quick answer, there was a pause. Then another pause. Someone suggested circling back. I watched quietly. That figure had always been validated by me, informally, off record, before it ever reached that room. This time I hadn't done that, not because I couldn't, but because no one had asked me to. The process had simply proceeded without its usual invisible reinforcement. No one looked at me. That was new. In the weeks that followed, similar moments accumulated. Small inefficiencies, slight delays, extra meetings that existed solely to clarify things that had once been understood. People began to feel a loss without knowing what they'd lost. Emails multiplied. Decision threads became longer. Language shifted from confident statements to tentative phrasing. We think, it seems. We may need to revisit. None of this was traced back to me. It couldn't be. I hadn't removed anything. I hadn't blocked anything. I had simply stopped supplying something that was never formally requested. And systems don't know how to mourn invisible labor. I noticed stress surfaces in places it never had before. Colleagues who used to summarize decisively now hedged. Senior figures who once moved quickly began asking for more documentation, more validation, more time. Ironically, this made my work more visible. Not because I announced it, but because its absence had shape. There was a meeting where a senior colleague said, "We need to be more careful with how these analyses are being interpreted." No one disagreed. The sentence hung there, vague but heavy. Careful how? Before, that carefulness had been me. Now it was a problem to be solved. I didn't feel satisfaction watching this unfold. I felt distance. The kind that comes when you finally step out of something you've been holding up for too long and realize how heavy it actually was. People weren't failing. They were adjusting. An adjustment is uncomfortable. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation in the hallway. Two colleagues discussing how things felt less smooth lately. One of them said, half joking, "Maybe we're missing something." They were closer than they realized. What struck me most was how quickly discomfort turned into reflection. Processes were questioned. Ownership was discussed. Documentation was requested where it had been before. The system was learning, slowly, awkwardly, that it couldn't rely on assumptions alone. And still, no one came to me directly. That told me they sensed the change but didn't want to name it, because naming it would mean acknowledging how much had previously been taken for granted. I stayed steady. I answered what I was asked. I delivered what I owned. Nothing more, nothing less. Quiet dominance isn't about watching others struggle. It's about letting reality surface without interference. By the time leadership began to notice the drag, the subtle loss of efficiency, they were looking for structural explanations, not individual ones. Which meant the story was no longer about me. And that was exactly where it needed to be. The tone changed before the language did. You could feel it in meetings. The way people arrived a little earlier, stayed a little longer, spoke a little more carefully. The casual confidence that once carried discussions forward had been replaced by something tighter, more cautious, as if everyone sensed that mistakes were becoming more visible, and visibility carried consequences. Leadership began asking questions they hadn't asked before. Not who did this, but how did this happen? Not why wasn't this caught, but where is this being reviewed? Those questions mattered, because they weren't aimed at individuals, they were aimed at the system. And systems don't like being examined when they've been relying on invisible labor. There was an attempt, quietly, to restore the old smoothness. Extra check-ins were added. Alignment meetings appeared on calendars. Senior colleagues began asking for pre-reads earlier than usual. The same colleague who had once overwritten my work without comment now asked me, politely, whether I had a moment to sanity check something. I did, but only what was explicitly mine. I no longer filled in gaps I wasn't responsible for. I no longer interpreted half decisions as final ones. When something wasn't clear, I said so. When approval hadn't been given, I waited. What surprised me was how quickly this restraint was misread as cooperation. People thought the system was healing, but it wasn't. It was adapting too late. Because the real issue wasn't process, it was dependency, an unspoken reliance that had never been formalized, documented, or acknowledged. And once that reliance is exposed, you can't simply recreate it on demand. Trust doesn't work that way. I watched a senior manager struggle through a presentation, carefully caveating points that would once have been stated with confidence. I watched follow-up questions multiply because no one was willing to stand behind assumptions anymore. This wasn't a failure. It was accountability arriving all at once. There was a meeting, one of the last before everything shifted fully, where someone suggested that roles needed to be clarified, that ownership should be more evenly distributed. I knew, in that moment, it was too late. Not because change wasn't possible, but because the version of the system that had depended on my silence was already gone. You can't unknow where stability came from once it's been revealed by its absence. After the meeting, the senior colleague approached me again. His tone was different now. Careful, almost deferential. He said, "We should probably formalize how we work together moving forward." I nodded, but I didn't rush to fill the space he'd left open, because formalization requires honesty, and honesty would require acknowledging things that had never been said out loud, about deleted work, redirected credit, questioned timelines, things that couldn't be addressed without rewriting the past. And the past, once documented, doesn't negotiate. I wasn't being stubborn. I wasn't being strategic for its own sake. I was simply no longer willing to step back into a role that existed only because I had allowed it to. By the time the organization tried to adjust, truly adjust, it wasn't about fixing a problem. It was about accepting a new reality, one where work had owners, one where assumptions had consequences, one where silence no longer masked imbalance. And in that reality, there was no clean way to put me back where I had been, which meant whatever came next would have to happen in full view. The confrontation, when it finally came, barely deserved the name. No raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic pause meant to signal importance. It happened in a small meeting room with the blinds half open, late in the afternoon, when the office had already begun to thin out. The senior colleague, the one who had overwritten my work, the one whose confidence once filled every meeting, sat across from me with a notebook open, pen resting but unused. He didn't look defensive. He looked careful. "We need to talk about how responsibilities are being handled," he said. I nodded, not as agreement, just acknowledgement. He spoke first, outlining concerns about delays, confusion, and the need for clearer ownership. His words were measured, managerial. He framed the situation as a shared challenge, something external that had crept up on all of us. I let him finish. Then I spoke, not to argue, not to correct his tone, just to state facts. I explained how my work had been used, revised, and sometimes removed without discussion. I referenced specific files, dates, versions. I described how assumptions had been attributed to me after the fact, and how timelines I didn't control had been questioned under my name. I didn't attach emotion to any of it. I didn't ask for apologies. I didn't speculate about intent. I simply described reality as it had unfolded. There was a long silence after that. Not awkward, just heavy. He flipped a page in his notebook, then closed it. For the first time, he didn't try to reframe what I'd said. He didn't minimize it. He didn't explain it away. He said quietly, "I didn't realize how much you were carrying." I believed him, not because it absolved anything, but because systems like ours are built to obscure exactly that kind of carrying, especially when the person doing it doesn't complain. I told him something else then, something simple. "I'm still willing to do the work," I said, "but only if ownership is clear beforehand." That was it. No ultimatum, no threat, no leverage spoken out loud. Just a boundary, stated calmly. He nodded again, slower this time. The meeting ended without resolution. No decisions were made, no next steps assigned. And strangely, that felt right, because clarity doesn't always arrive as agreement. Sometimes it arrives as an end to ambiguity. In the weeks that followed, our interactions changed. He was more deliberate, more transparent. He asked before revising. He credited directly. And when he didn't know something, he said so. We never spoke again about the past. We didn't need to. The confrontation hadn't been about settling scores. It had been about making something visible. And once visible, it no longer needed defending. What stayed with me wasn't his response. It was my own. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't justified my worth. I hadn't asked to be seen. I had simply refused to continue unseen. That, I realized, was what quiet dominance actually looked like. Not control, not intimidation, but composure paired with truth. And once you experience that alignment, you don't chase validation anymore. You recognize yourself without needing the room to confirm it. I didn't leave the company. That surprises people when I tell this story. They expect a clean break, a resignation letter, a new role somewhere else, a decisive exit that wraps everything up neatly. But growth doesn't always require distance. Sometimes it requires staying long enough to inhabit a different posture. I'm still in the same organization, the same building, the same general role. But the way I move through my work now is fundamentally different. I no longer confuse calm with compliance. I speak when clarity is needed, not when silence is convenient. I document before I deliver. I ask for ownership before I accept responsibility. None of this feels radical. It feels adult, grounded. People respond to me differently now. Not dramatically, not deferentially, but attentively. When I speak in meetings, I'm listened to. Not because I've raised my voice, but because I've reduced my noise. My words aren't filler anymore. They're intentional. And intention carries weight. I'm still described as reliable. But now the word has edges. It implies judgment, not just endurance. People don't assume they can offload ambiguity onto me. They bring me into conversations earlier. They ask before deciding, not after. And when something goes wrong, the question isn't automatically my name. That shift didn't come from confrontation. It came from consistency, from aligning what I was willing to do with what I was willing to own. I no longer take pride in being the person who saves things at the last minute. I take pride in being the person whose work doesn't need saving because it was framed correctly from the start. The emotional change has been subtle but profound. I'm not carrying resentment. There's no bitterness here. I don't replay old moments in my head looking for different outcomes. Those moments served their purpose. They showed me where I was disappearing. Now I don't disappear. I also don't dominate. Quiet dominance, I've learned, isn't about becoming someone else. It's about removing the habits that taught people to overlook you. It's about boundaries that don't need defending because they're consistently applied. There are still days when the old reflex kicks in, when I see confusion forming and feel the urge to smooth it over automatically. When that happens, I pause. I ask myself a simple question. Is this mine to carry? If the answer is yes, I do it fully. If the answer is no, I let the discomfort exist. That discomfort doesn't make me cruel. It makes the system honest. Who I am now isn't louder. It isn't harder. It isn't more aggressive. It's clearer. And clarity, I've learned, is one of the most underrated forms of strength there is. There's a temptation, when a story like this ends, to look for a villain, to point to a name, a title, a moment where someone clearly crossed a line and everything broke because of it. But that's not how most imbalance works. It doesn't arrive with malice. It arrives through habit, through convenience, through the quiet agreement that someone else will always handle it. For a long time, that someone was me. Not because I was weak, not because I lacked ability, but because I believed that doing good work in silence was enough. It took me years to understand that silence, when it becomes automatic, stops being humility and starts being instruction. It teaches people what you will absorb, what you will correct without credit, what you will carry without acknowledgement. And systems learn quickly. The moral of this story isn't stand up for yourself loudly. It isn't expose people. It isn't walk away the moment you feel undervalued. It's this. If you keep translating ambiguity into comfort for others, don't be surprised when they forget who made things work. Quiet dominance isn't about winning. It's about alignment, about making sure your effort, your accountability, and your identity are in the same place. I didn't demand recognition. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't wait for permission. I simply stopped disappearing. And when I did, the system had no choice but to adjust. Not because I forced it to, but because reality became visible again. If you're watching this and you recognize yourself in any part of this story, if you're the one who fixes, smooths, absorbs, and explains, let me say this clearly. Your calm is valuable. Your restraint is powerful, but only when it's chosen. Silence should be a tool, not a trap. Before you try to change anyone else, ask yourself one thing. What am I carrying that no one ever asked me to? And then decide, quietly, deliberately, whether you want to keep carrying it. I'd really like to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where your reliability made you invisible? Or was stopping, just slightly, changed how people treated you? Share your experience in the comments. Not to complain, not to blame, but to make the invisible visible. together.